Now, they're two world leaders who are seen by many as outcasts on the global stage. Today, they came together. Russia's Vladimir Putin travelled to North Korea to meet Kim Jong Un in Pyongyang. There was a red carpet welcome for Mr. Putin for his first visit to the country in 24 years. It was full of ceremony, complete with red roses, crowds and a grand military parade. Russian state media is reporting that a partnership agreement's been signed with North Korea on Wednesday, and they said it was defensive in nature. It quoted him as saying North Korea had a right to defend itself. He was speaking after talks which Mr. Putin had said covered security and international issues. Meanwhile, Mr. Kim's been delivering remarks, and he called Russia the most honest friend and ally, referring to President Putin as the dearest friend of the Korean people. Well, the two leaders also exchanged gifts during that visit, with Mr. Kim receiving a tea set and a luxury Russian-made Urus car. An aide to the Kremlin said. Now, the Kremlin did not say yet what gifts Mr. Putin had received, but hinted they were related to Vladimir Putin's image, including busts. Well, this is what Russian President Mr. Putin had to say about Kim Jong Un's support for the war in Ukraine.
We highly appreciate your consistent and unwavering support for Russian policy, including the Ukrainian direction. I mean our fight against the hegemonic imperialist policy imposed for decades by the United States and its satellites toward the Russian Federation.
Now we can speak to David O from the BBC Korean service, who joins me live from Seoul. You've covered North and South Korea's relationship for a long time. First of all, what is the perspective on this meeting today from the South Korean side?
Yes, I have to say that I've been seeing this quite unusual picture, as you also showed, so that the Putin and Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong Un together shaking hands. I mean, we saw them in September last year, but as you mentioned, it's been more than 2 decades that Vladimir Putin went to Pyongyang himself. And they had more than 2 hours of a meeting today, and after the meeting they signed an agreement. And this is very important. We know this signed agreement that is called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, but we still don't know what that exactly means. Some details are emerging from the news reports that Russian news reports saying that Putin was quoted as saying this is a breakthrough document, and Kim Jong Un was quoted as saying this is the strongest ever treaty. But what does that mean? For instance, the war in Ukraine. Is that means that North Korea will be actively engaging war in Ukraine? We still don't know. But now some details are emerging, and that people are comparing that this agreement similar to the agreement they signed in 1961 before Soviet Union, and that agreement was finished by when South Korea made diplomatic ties with Russia in 1990s. So that means that the two countries are becoming closer than ever in 1990s. I think that's the possibility, and we have to wait and see.
OK, David O in Seoul, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's take a broader look at that meeting and see how another close ally of Russia, China, feels about this visit. Well, joining me now is our China correspondent, Laura Becker, who's been following developments from Beijing. Laura, first of all, you've covered South Korea and North Korea before you got to China. So I'd just like to get your broader thoughts on this meeting in the first place, seeing these two leaders side by side, exchanging those gifts, full red carpet welcome. What's your take on it?
Well, one of the things I'm poring over is that agreement that David just mentioned. It's called a mutual defence pact, and it would appear that if the other comes under aggression, as President Putin put it in the press conference, the other would come to each other would come to their aid. Now, how strongly that will be taken is hard to know, and it might actually be so ambiguous that it's difficult for us to figure out. And I think the other thing is it might be deliberately ambiguous to keep the West guessing. We may never really know. But as David alluded to there, what is happening between these two is an upgrade of their friendship to what Kim Jong Un called an alliance. But what I would caution, because there are many across the West, many sitting in Seoul, in Ukraine, in Washington and in London watching this, wondering if this is a new so-called axis of evil. What I would caution is that when it comes to ties between Russia and North Korea, there are many limitations. And one of those limitations is here in Beijing and their friendship with Beijing. China already has a mutual defence treaty with North Korea, so they'll be looking at this document very carefully. But it seems that China is standing back from this partnership. They may not even fully agree with it. When Mr. Putin was here in May for a visit with President Xi, it is understood and was reported at the time that Beijing officials asked Mr. Putin not to go straight to Pyongyang from here in Beijing. They said they did not like the optics. China doesn't want to be seen as part of a trilateral. Yes, they say this is an agreement between North Korea and Russia. This is a meeting between President Putin and Kim Jong Un. China wants to stand back from that. And actually, today, the Chinese officials are meeting with South Korean officials in Seoul just to show that they have footprint right around the region. And there's a good reason from China's point of view. They're trying to appeal to the world as a global leader. They want to have a partnership with the West. They need its business, for instance. They do not want to be a global pariah.
OK, Laura, and you've covered the Koreas as well. More specifically, what else do you think's in it for them?
When I look at this mutual defence pact, I would say that South Korea, this is the red line that South Korea did not want. So I think when we look to see the wording of it, that's what South Korea will be looking for. You know, the issue around the border right now is incredibly tense. It's the most tense it's been. I think the other thing is, when you look at how different things are, when I was in Korea back between 2017 and 2022, this was a very different North Korea and a very different Korean partnership. We had the emerging of Kim Jong Un from Pyongyang. He met with the South Korean president 3 times. He met with Donald Trump 3 times. He met with President Xi 3 times. Back then, Vladimir Putin, he only met once. Then they were not firm friends, and now they seem fast friends trying to upgrade their alliance. And that is because they need one another. North Korea needs money, it needs fuel. Around 50% of its fuel comes from Russia. When it comes to Russia, they need ammunition from North Korea to help its campaign in Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why the two are getting together now. Certainly in the past, this is not a relationship that either had prioritised. North Korea had prioritised its relationship with China. 85% of its trade, if not more, comes from China. So when it comes to both of them, yes, they're upgrading their partnership with each other, but they won't want to jeopardise the relationship with China.
Great to have your insight on this story. Laura Bicker, our correspondent in Beijing. Well, our correspondent in Ukraine, Jean McKenzie, reports from Kyiv on these talks, and she gave us her take on how Ukraine is likely to be viewing this visit.
Look, this visit is very bad news for Ukraine, of course, because one of the major challenges that Ukraine has faced throughout this war is a shortage of ammunition compared to the Russians. You know, Ukraine has had a really tough time over the past 6 months because it didn't get those vital supplies of ammunition from the United States because that US aid package was held up in Congress. And so when it looks to Russia and it sees that Vladimir Putin has this partner in North Korea, which has the ability to supply it with vast amounts of ammunition, then of course that is worrying. Ukraine's foreign minister was speaking yesterday to the BBC's Hard Talk programme, and he said that what this visit showed was that neither Ukraine nor Russia was going to be able to continue fighting this war on its own. And what it was going to come down to, essentially, was how much each side's allies were able to provide it with and willing to provide it with. So Ukraine is going to use this meeting to keep pressing its allies to send more weapons, but also to reiterate this message it has that that this is not just a war in Ukraine. Russia is waging a war of aggression against the rest of the world. You know, this is not just something that even threatens Europe now, it touches Asia too. We have pretty solid evidence now that North Korea has been supplying Russia with ammunition and weapons since about August last year. So the United States, the UK, South Korea, they've all produced intelligence to this effect that thousands of shipping containers have gone back between North Korea and Russia, filled likely with these artillery shells. We've also had similar work from open source investigators who've been tracking these containers going backwards and forwards, also movement across the two countries' rail border. Now, a lot of this comes from North Korea's stockpiles because North Korea is still technically at war with South Korea, so it has to hold on to a vast number of shells. Some of the estimates have been that now millions of shells have been sent. So the big question actually is, with this meeting, how much longer can North Korea continue to supply Russia at the rate we think it has been since about August last year? Because if a lot of this stuff is coming from stockpiles, of course that has a limit. So at some point North Korea is going to have to be producing this stuff, and that might be at a slower rate. Now, South Korea's defense minister said earlier this year that they had noticed that North Korea's weapons factories were operating at full tilt. And one of the questions in all of this has always been, well, what is North Korea getting back from the Russians in return for these weapons? And something the United States has put forward, one kind of theory, is that Russia could decide to provide North Korea with some of the raw materials it needs to produce some of these weapons, perhaps the logistical support that it needs to turn this stuff around. And if Russia is actually able to amp up its production through North Korea, then of course this is very bad news for Ukraine.
That's Jean McKenzie there in Ukraine with her thoughts on this meeting between Kim and Putin.